Good evening and welcome. My name is Kurt Volker. I'm the Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership, and I want to welcome you to our debate on whether college campuses are eroding free speech, and I want to thank you all for coming. We have a terrific team of debaters here. We are live casting this on Facebook. We are recording this, and we hope to produce an edited summary version of this later on after the debate is over. And I wanted to tell you a little bit first about the McCain Institute and then to introduce our debaters. The McCain Institute was founded in 2012 at the initiative of Senator McCain and President Michael Crow of Arizona State University. And it is designed to advance values and character-driven leadership and to take direct action on issues involving humanitarian assistance, human rights and democracy, national security, global rule of law and governance. And we have had a tremendous ride over the last 7 years, growing really by leaps and bounds. One of the things that we stand for as an institute, though, is civil political discourse, and we have a hashtag campaign. I'd encourage you to support hashtag Acts of Civility. And it is designed to really encourage and foster debate, to respect differences of view, and to be able to talk about those in a constructive environment in order to focus really on the goals that we all share, which are making our lives and our countries and our world a better place. Tonight's debate is one in a series. We've had a number of debates about a variety of foreign policy issues, from whether we should be intervening in Syria to pulling out of Afghanistan to whether we should be viewing U.S. AID assistance as something that the United States ought to be increasing or decreasing. And this is the first one we've done on a domestic policy issue, but it's one that has been in the news a lot, which is whether college campuses are a place that is protecting and encouraging and supporting free speech, or whether, in fact, there are threats to the exercise of free speech on college campuses. To debate this, we have a really all-star panel on these topics. And we framed this, I should say, as a debate among two teams. We have one that will answer broadly to the question, is there an erosion of free speech? Yes, there is. And on that team, we have Robbie Suave, who is the editor of Reason Magazine, associate editor of Reason Magazine, and has written about this topic from the perspective of there is an issue here. And with him is Samantha Harris, who's the vice president of policy research at FIRE. And FIRE is not spelled out in my notes here, but I was reading it earlier today. It is
Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you very much. Which has done, it really produces a terrific current news feed about events that are relevant to the issue of free speech on college campuses. So it's a great one-stop shopping for knowing what people are talking about. On the opposite side, say, no, college campuses, there's a lot of negative news out there, but college campuses are indeed still performing that role of encouraging open expression, open debate, and nurturing an environment of learning and tolerance. We have Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan University, and we have Sandy Unger, who is the director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. And all of them have written about these topics. You can Google them, you can find things online. And we look forward to hearing from all of them in the course of this debate. Now, one thing about the debate, we structure this in a way to try to make sure that we do give equal time to disparate points of view. We will open up with an argument for each side of 4 minutes each to articulate their view of how this question should be viewed. Then we follow up with the opportunity of a short rebuttal or a short response to the other side's opening statement. Then we'll turn to some questions, first from me. Each side will have 2 minutes to address that question, and then a minute to respond to that addressing of that question. Then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And so I hope that you are thinking about issues that are on your mind and that we can pitch to the debaters as well. So to give us an opening argument and to share with us your argument as to why you think there may be a problem here. Are college campuses eroding free speech? And Robbie and Samantha, I turn to you.
Hi. So the question of whether college campuses are eroding free speech, I think, could be answered in a number of ways, depending on who you think is or isn't doing the eroding. I'm going to frame my argument this way. I think that too many college administrators are allowing ill-informed student demands for censorship to erode free speech on campus, rather than standing up for that right. So, for example, when angry students demanded that Yale University lecturer Erica Christakis resign from her role as a residential college dean for sending an email asking students to think critically about whether it was appropriate for Yale to police students' Halloween costumes, the Yale administration's silence was deafening. Erica Christakis was left twisting in the wind. Fellow professors reached out to her privately, saying that they supported her but felt it was too risky to speak their minds. Ultimately, she left Yale, saying that, quote, "I lost confidence that I could continue to teach in an environment where full discussion of certain topics has become almost taboo." When Northwestern University professor Laura Kipnis wrote an editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Education decrying what she called a climate of sexual paranoia on campus, students filed complaints against her with the university's Title IX office. The Title IX office obliged, launching a protracted investigation into Professor Kipnis for her editorial that ended only when Kipnis published a second editorial in the Chronicle titled "My Title IX Inquisition." After Emory law professor Paul Zwier used the N-word in a class while discussing the facts of a civil rights case, students complained, and the university removed him from classes and banned him from campus. And his termination hearing at Emory is coming up at the beginning of next month. So yes, I would say that free speech is being eroded on college campuses, and that if the people who run our universities don't take a stronger stand for free speech in the face of these student demands for censorship, it's only going to get worse.
Yes, just to join in on that, I have spoken with professors at campuses all across the country who tell me privately, because they're afraid to say this publicly, that they fear their own students. Not all of them, not even most of them, but they feel offending a small number of often very radically progressive students, and these professors are often of the left themselves. They're afraid they'll use language or they'll say something that they believe that will cause some student to feel traumatized, and they'll be investigated by the administration for having offended this person in a manner that speaks to educational or workplace safety. There is a compliance culture at universities. There are tremendously powerful and growing bureaucracies of administrators who are there to, not all of them, but many of them, to help the students feel more safe and more comfortable. And some students, again, not all of them, and I don't think most of them, have abused or have taken advantage of that kind of additional over-the-top protection being offered by more and more administrators. The ranks of the administrators have grown dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years at almost all colleges and universities. I don't pretend that this is a problem across the board at every university in the country. Many are having interesting and nuanced discussions and debates about public policy, but at too many, I think, of our most elite, elite institutions of higher learning, a culture is developing where people are afraid to express controversial ideas because there will be retaliation from students or from administrators or from other figures. I should note that this is not only a problem of the ideological left. Of course, there are right-leaning and conservative watchdog groups who are all the time trying to get professors in trouble for having done or said things that offend them, and professors are punished all the time for offending this group as well. It's not a crisis across the board, but it is a serious problem to which we ought to pay a great deal of attention.
Okay, thank you. So to hear from people who actually administer colleges, Michael, as I said, is the president of Wesleyan University, and I should have mentioned also Sandy is a former president of Goucher College. So how does it look from your standpoint?
I think I'm going to begin. Well, I don't recognize this bleak landscape that our friends are describing on the other side. There are many discussions in every discipline, at every point on the political spectrum, outside speakers, university students, faculty members, at a large number of colleges and universities. They come and go without problems. They discuss things across the political spectrum, and like the airplanes that land and don't crash, these calm intellectual experiences don't get reported on or written about. Of course, it's not surprising. It's what's supposed to happen at colleges and universities. I agree that there have been some excesses, and my project at Georgetown University is trying to track challenges to free expression, free speech around the country in the areas of education, civil society, and government. And what we have found is that, contrary to what Samantha describes, that actually there is, and it may be growing, it's not universal, but it may be growing in some places, but there is suppression of free speech across the political spectrum. I think it's interesting that we don't hear so much about the suppression of liberal speech. Robbie alluded to it a moment ago, but liberal speech is suppressed in many cases just as conservative speech is, and we have many examples of it on our free speech tracker online, freespeechproject.georgetown.edu, and it's really quite striking how this is a problem that comes across both sides. I think that one of the things that's happened is that we've pigeonholed just about everybody has to declare himself or herself as being on the left or the right, having to be a conservative or a liberal, and be classified, be identified. I'm glad we don't yet have to walk around wearing labels, but I wonder if that won't come from some force or another in order to prove the preponderance of liberals over conservatives, and I certainly hope it won't happen. I think there's much more open discourse going on than people recognize.
So I agree with my colleague, of course. That's the way this is set up. I think that it's no accident, as people without evidence sometimes say, that we're talking about free speech crisis on college campus instead of talking about a free speech crisis in the United States. When the President of the United States today, for, I don't know, the 200th time, attacked a major newspaper because it says things he doesn't like. When, in order to get the word out, you need to have the cooperation of people who have tons of money and power and can support enterprises to either distort the news or to claim things that are true that have no truth to them. Our students may have had a slight reduction of confidence in the doctrine of free speech because they have seen that doctrine used by ideologues to push a right-wing agenda that demonizes intellectuals and universities and creates a notion of speech that includes all kinds of activity that were never thought of as protected activities before. So I think there are real threats to free speech in the United States. I think on college campuses you are much likely to find liberals arguing with conservatives. A person like myself, a secular Jew, teaching Aquinas tomorrow morning. Other faculty members who are Marxists teaching Plato, and et cetera. But in the public sphere, where money and power can amplify voices so that no one else is heard, that's a crisis of free speech, and our students recognize that appeals to a pure principle of free expression often cover over the doctrine of a free market economy and leading to the increased power of those who have money and privilege.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I want to turn it back to the first team to just give a response to what you've heard or any of the other comments that that you would like to make at this point. We'll turn back to Michael and Sandy after that, and then we'll get into some Q&A.
So I think, first of all, I think that a lot of what we are all saying here is not actually mutually exclusive. I don't think that the problems with free speech in society are limited to campus. And I also don't, as Robbie said, they're not limited to the left or the right. They're both, and a lot of cases of suppression of speech we see are not partisan at all. They have to do with universities trying to suppress speech that's critical of the university. It's also interesting that, of the cases I described, Sandy framed them as conservative speech. At least two of the three professors I know for certain are people who are on the left. So while the censorship may have also come from students on the left, the censorship really can't be broken down along political lines. And I think it's a mistake, across the board, whether from the left or from the right, to politicize the free speech debate. I think that There's just a lack of courage I see on campus and off. As Michael was describing with the president, people need to stand up for the right to free speech. They need to push back against institutional official censorship wherever it's coming from. I wouldn't use the term crisis on campus, but is it being eroded? I would say yes.
And I would add just quickly, I wish it was only a slight reduction in wanting to defend free speech on the left. I think it is much more than a slight reduction. I have heard from, I've engaged with, I've interviewed activist students of the left all the time who routinely tell me things about free speech that are not true, you can have free speech, but if you're engaged in hate speech, then your speech is not free speech and it's not constitutionally protected. That is a widespread view among young people, particularly among the active ideological left, that is false, and everyone knows it's false. This is something that historically activists sort of left, like the ACLU, would have said, well, of course the Nazis and the KKK and the white nationalists get to march and we will defend their right to do so, or the Westboro Baptist Church, or whoever the objectionable group is. That belief is certainly eroding among younger activist people on the left, based on what I hear from them day in and day out, and that does concern me, that will result in a society-wide threat to free speech.
And Michael?
Yeah, sure. I think the case of Yale is instructive in this instance. Usually the very elite schools are not going to give you a good sense of what's happening in the country. They are extraordinarily distorted environments. But in the case of the professor who wound up resigning from Yale, I think that was a travesty, and I agree with your comments. But the video of the student who had a meltdown in the courtyard was circulated, perhaps the people who circulated it on the internet, and that student was for months subjected to death threats. That to me is a much more serious issue. The professor that Fire defended, who gave the commencement address at Hampshire, was subjected to death threats. That is a serious issue, an issue of polarization in the country and on college campuses. I think where we do agree is that when people complain of self-censorship, when they complain, I'm not going to speak because I may get yelled at, that is a failure of courage. I don't think that's a free speech crisis so much. It is a failure of courage on the part of people who don't want to speak because they will be criticized. Well, they have to buck up.
Robbie, in fairness, I've read your book, as you know.
We had another debate about
it. You're citing some excellent interviews, some anecdotal evidence in your book. In fact, the evidence that somehow young people are less interested in free speech than they were before, and that they're more interested in inclusion, is the result of a travesty in public opinion surveys, in my view. There are people conducting surveys and asking students, posing a completely ridiculous, false, unnecessary dichotomy between free speech and inclusion, as if they were opposed and it were a natural thing to juxtapose. That's like asking somebody, do they prefer red beets or chicken, which have nothing to do with each other. And in fact, as we know, free speech is one of the greatest tools for inclusion, the encouragement of free speech, the leveling of a playing field, getting everybody to participate in free and open dialogue and speech at our colleges and universities and everywhere else. And we should not be falling into this habit of asking students to choose one over the other is more important, because I think most of the people answering those polls are not answering on the basis of lived experience, but rather what they've heard to be the case.
Well, thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask a few questions and turn them respectively to each of the teams. And I want to start with our team saying there is an erosion, because I want to ask you, Robbie and Samantha, is there such a thing as hate speech? And how would you define it, and does it need to be limited in some way?
Do you want to take the Supreme Court view?
Sure. If there is speech that is hateful, right? Some of that speech is protected, some of it is not. If it's hateful and the person is saying, I hate you and therefore I'm going to come to your house and kill you, that's not protected. The problem is that unlike in Europe, where there are actually laws regulating quote unquote hate speech, there's not a legal category of speech in the United States called hate speech. And most hateful speech is constitutionally protected. So when people say, in response to, well, no, that person who has said something hateful is exercising their right to free speech. Well, no, that's not free speech. That's hate speech. That's a false dichotomy because a lot of hate speech in the United States, at least, is free speech, so long as it doesn't fall into one of the categories of speech that don't merit constitutional protection: threats, genuine harassment, incitement to violence.
And I've seen a dramatic expansion of what the people saying we should not have hate speech are counting as hate speech. I mean, I've seen students describe mundane pro-political advocacy, like pro-Trump advocacy, or having a sign that's for re-electing Trump, describe that as hate speech, the kind of speech these people think should not be protected by the First Amendment. I mean, just this week I wrote about, I think it was Texas A&M, the president of the college Democrats was quoted in the newspaper saying something to the effect of, well, if the campus Republican group is having an event, that's going to make people unsafe. That's not the kind of thing we should want to allow here. If we're expanding what hate speech is and your right to feel safe so broadly as to make mundane, like totally normal political advocacy speech is what these activist types think should not be permissible, and they're having administrators listening to them, I think that is very concerning.
I would agree.
Go ahead.
I would agree that it is concerning, and there are cases that are wacky. I mean, they're just they are wrong or
On all sides.
and
Yes.
on all sides. But many students do think that it may be constitutionally protected, but it's still worthy of a criticism, or even they use the slang canceling. The great expansion is not the category of hate speech. The great expansion is the case of Citizens United. The great expansion is to treat corporations as if they were speakers, and to give corporations the right to dominate the airwaves, and to give corporations the right to amplify their speech without restriction. And the people who supported that are the people who support the organizations that worry about whether hate speech has grown too much. I mean, there are funny examples. You could find idiotic things on a college campus. What else is new? But the real story is the dramatic expansion of corporate control of amplifying speech in America. Not that some people at Texas A&M criticized the Republican Party.
Right. Before you come in, Samantha, I just want to say, so I understand what you're saying in terms of the powers behind the pressures on this. But then my question then comes to be, well, who gets to decide? If the Supreme Court has one view and we have laws in the country that are one view, on a college campus, then who gets to decide the standard might be different, and under what criteria? So.
Well, I'd like to come back to what Robbie was saying before, because to paraphrase Potter, the late Justice Potter Stewart on obscenity, he can't define it, but he knows it when he sees it. I'm not sure I can define hate speech, but I know it when I hear it, and I know it when I see it. And there is a great deal of hate speech in this country that is terrifying people. Now, that doesn't mean that people do not all have a right to express themselves, but they don't all have a right to be listened to and to be given credibility, and for every word that everybody says to be equated in value with every word that everyone else says. And we know what hate speech is. We know about the tremendous rise of hate on the right in the United States, white nationalists, white supremacists. We know about the tragic events at Charlottesville and some of the sequelae of Charlottesville as well, some of the other things going on. That is something that we have to be afraid of. That doesn't mean that people can't express themselves, but in some cases they are expressing feelings, and they are being translated into mass shootings, combined with the Second Amendment. There is a real problem that the ACLU has had to recognize, and others in this country. So no, a Democratic club saying that a Republican club having an event is going to be hate speech, that's ridiculous, and everybody knows that. And I don't think you should use those examples, Robbie, because they're not common enough to be a serious problem. And as Michael says, many people on many campuses say many ridiculous things, and that's all part of the landscape. But there is some real hate speech going on. It doesn't necessarily have to be banned in every case, but it has to be treated carefully, and in some instances has to be investigated.
But I'm going to be persistent here, and I want to, maybe Michael, who gets to decide if what the judiciary and the federal government and the Congress have decided is admissible free speech on a college campus to say, oh no, you can't do that here?
They're typical filters that college campuses have, that faculty in the biology department don't invite creationists, even if they say we're underrepresented. The historians, even if there was a major foundation that wanted to pay for a journal of Holocaust deniers, that doesn't mean that we should have conferences that are sponsored by such people. Who gets to decide? The history faculty in that case, the biology faculty in the other case. And most of the time, this works out pretty well. Sometimes people make dumb mistakes. They seem to be unreasonably offended. And other times, they seem to actually understand that a university community is not there so that you can test your free speech credentials. A university community is there to educate the students. And somebody has to decide what counts as education. That's the job of the faculty. And who else is going to decide?
Okay, Samantha?
The thing that I often say, the question you raise is a really important one, which is, once you delegate to the authorities of any sort the ability to decide what speech is too hateful to be spoken, what I often say to people is, look, if this can happen, do you want Donald Trump deciding what's hate speech? Because what's he going to say is hate speech? Things that are unpatriotic, things that are, when you give the government or any other entity that's regulating you the power to make that kind of subjective determination, you're delegating away a lot of your rights. And I think that, we can't ignore that sort of the subjectivity that comes in when you're talking about a term like hate speech, as opposed to threats, harassment, things like that that have objective legal definitions.
Robbie?
You two are good pro-free speech liberals, and you're saying these things that I'm talking about, that Samantha's talking about, that I wrote the book about, are not representative. They are crazy. You agree that they're crazy, but it's just random crazy people. It's not connected to anything. I disagree. I wish you were right, and I hope you're right, but I think it's very much in vogue with the new, not the culture of all young people, but particularly of loud, vocal, politically engaged people on many of our most elite campuses, which will graduate people who go on to affect our society, our legal society, our law, our media institutions, who will carry with them the norms they've internalized about speech at these places. So there will be a large impact by a few number of these wacky people.
I agree with you on this. I think that this is a danger. This is a danger, but I think we have to ask ourselves, why don't these people believe the content-neutral, legalistic definitions that work for other people?
Yeah.
And I think the reason they don't believe it is because they've seen it perverted by money and power in this country for at least the last 20 years. They've seen free speech doctrine used to protect policy decisions and to protect corporate greed. And so that when they hear the old things that used to work for me, I still like those things, they hear that, they think that's just a cover, because they've seen it used as a cover to advance an ideological agenda. So it was 5-4. So it's now sacrosanct? No. They don't believe it's true because they've seen it perverted by power and money.
So a natural reaction to that is that people may feel the need to self-censor, that they feel they're in an environment of some kind of group perception, and they don't feel comfortable speaking up against that. And I think there was a survey that Gallup did which said 61% of students on college campuses felt that they self-censored in order to avoid going against the grain or offending people. On the one hand, I kind of react to that saying, good, they're growing up. and on the other hand, I say, but that's not good, especially if that definition of what's offensive to someone is expanding and you're feeling like you're contracting in your abilities to speak. So what would you say about that?
Kurt, some surveys you hear about and they correspond to something you've been suspecting to be the case or that you thought might be the case. Then you hear the results of some surveys that are just, I've been working in higher education since 1986. So how many years is that? About 33. And I don't know, I have not seen a classroom environment or a college or university environment in the 4 institutions I've worked in where I believe that 61% of the students are afraid to say what they think. It just doesn't ring true to my lived experience. I think there are some on both sides, in some cases, who are worried about expressing their opinions. I hope that as they advance through college, they become more courageous about doing so, and they speak up. That's, as I think Michael said earlier, that's a question of, maybe it was in the other room, I'm not sure, having the courage to express your opinions. That's very important. But I do not personally believe that 61% of college students are afraid to express their views.
Robbie?
To hammer what you said, I don't agree that Citizens United or giving corporations more speech rights is something that has affected the kinds of people I interviewed for my book, the activist students who hold a very different and I think wrong and dangerous view of free speech. They told me virtually every time over and over again that if you're saying speech that makes someone I'm sympathetic to feel uncomfortable, their emotional health is a component of their physical well-being, their safety. So you doing that is like you are engaged in violence against them, and that should either is or should be prohibited. So it's always about their safety, about the expansion of the component of mental health. Young people are very open, I don't know if you've talked to many of them, very open about their mental health, their traumas, their triggers, etc. Universities have been more and more willing to consider a larger variety of things to protect them. Many of them valid. I'm glad there are more mental health resources for students who need them. But it has had a speech component for some of these young people, and I keep ending my thoughts with, and this is concerning. And this is concerning.
I'm going to move on. I'd like someone, and maybe Samantha, I'm going to turn to you. What is a safe space?
You know, that's a term that I think, to me, that's a red herring in the campus.
What is a free speech space?
What is a free speech space? I mean, a free speech space is a space where, people can speak their minds free of institutional or official censorship. I mean, I think there are really two separate and potentially related phenomena we're talking about here. One is the degree of actual institutional censorship, and the other is this intense social pressure, I think amplified by social media. I mean, it's interesting, this is a little bit of an aside, but when we're talking about the factors that make young people less supportive of free speech, one of the things that I had never thought of until I was participating in an event with a college student who was taking sort of less of the free speech viewpoint, she was saying that, for a lot of people starting college now, their first experiences with free speech has been a Twitter mob, essentially, has been posting something on social media and being, subjected to vile and awful commentary. And that's terrible. And, that's a big part of it. And I think, we are asking people to have courage. We also need to recognize it's difficult sometimes to ask people to have courage in the face of that type of, vitriol. And I think that a lot of discussion needs to be had about how to, teach people to resist that kind of social pressure. Because I think that, when we talk about safe spaces, that's thrown around a lot as, colleges are coddling their students with these safe spaces and things. There was an article in the New York Times about one at Brown University. That I really do think is a red herring. I don't think that that's, colleges are doing that to the extent that some of the media, particularly the conservative media, would like to have you think they are. So I don't know if I really answered your question there, but maybe I opened up some.
You didn't, but you provoked two emotional responses here.
Well, Kurt, I want to come back to the definition of safe spaces, but I want to amend something that Samantha said about what students' first experience is with free speech issues. And one of the things we have documented in my project is that in high schools around this country, there is a huge assault on free speech. And it comes from both directions, that you must not talk about this in your commencement speech if you're the valedictorian. You must not talk about that. You mustn't publish something in the school newspaper or the school video feed because it will make the school look bad. And I think a lot of students, this has been a revelation to me, that a lot of students are arriving in college with a very bad experience concerning free speech in the last years of high school.
Does not surprise me
That
at all.
I agree with.
Yes.
And it's
So we
no
have a
wonder.
consensus here. We blame the high
But
school.
the court is not as unfortunately not has been as favorable to high school students. The Supreme Court has ruled against high school students' free speech rights. I think probably you think wrongly.
Yeah.
but unfortunately they don't have quite the legal regime defending their rights.
Well, there are some cases we can return to, like Tinker v. Des Moines, where the standard was set that high school students could engage in political actions as long as it didn't disrupt the normal process of the
And
school.
fire has recognized that problem.
Michael.
So I think that, that this is not a legalistic issue. This is a cultural and political issue. And so I'm a little invested in this because I've written a book called Safe Enough Spaces. And, and I think part of our job as administrators is to defend the rights of faculty and students who make other faculty and students uncomfortable. But in order to do that, students have to have some basic sense of safety. Then they won't be attacked, harassed, there won't be retribution, but that they feel safe enough to actually get into intellectual combat, to understand that they might be wrong and that they should want to hear other views, not to convince someone else that they're right, but because they might find out that they're wrong. And the question would then be, well, who decides whether the space is safe enough? Well, that's going to be a cultural and political decision. I don't think you're going to be able to cite a case of law to get off the hook of having to make a political, ethical, and cultural judgment.
Kurt, I want to answer your question about safe spaces too, though. When I first became a college president in 2001, and I saw that some offices of faculty and staff had a sticker on it that said safe space. And so I thought a safe space was this wonderful thing, that faculty members and staff members were saying, you can come in here and talk about anything. You don't have to worry about it. And only when I started to read about it and some other views of it did I discover that safe spaces were suddenly supposed to be a bad thing. And that's why I think Samantha's right in some ways that this is a red herring. It's not a universally defined thing. I think that the term safe spaces should apply to the entire college and university campus. People should be free to say what's on their mind and to exercise in speech and expression activities without having to worry whether they're on the right side of a line or not.
Right. And I think you put your finger on it, Sandy, because I think that is the perception that is driving a debate around a lot of this. Are safe spaces places where you can go and say anything you want and no one will be against you? Or is it a place where you can go so you do not have to be confronted with things that you find offensive? I mean, which is the definition of this?
Right.
Well,
Are
the
they safe
former
for
is what I
speech or
think it
safe
should-
from speech?
Well,
I guess is
you
what you're
have-
saying.
You have some of both. So, if you have a university or college Hillel, and you're a Jewish student, you might go there because you feel safe, and that not that the Jews are going to agree about anything really. They'll argue and fight, but there will be some degree of safety from anti-Semitism and other ideologies perhaps that challenge the feeling of that group. And I think there are other groups that have such spaces, and as long as they're kind of permeable and people can move in and out of them, they're safe enough, but they're not cloisters, they're not silos, I think, and it's our job as teachers and administrators to keep opening them up.
The great former president of Williams College, Morty Shapiro, who's now the president of Northwestern University, has said, to his great credit, what's all this uproar about safe spaces? What about the country clubs? What about the places where people were able to retreat for all these years and not see anybody who was different from them? Were those safe spaces okay?
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it to the audience in a moment, so please think about your questions. I'd like to call on you. But what I'm taking from this discussion so far is a surprising consensus on one point, which is that we have an issue of free speech in society. So it is played out on college campuses rather than college campuses being something special. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, and again, my criticism is not a generational criticism because, right, surveys of people in general, they're bad on free speech, or they give conflicting answers, they don't really understand. It depends how you word it, just like you said, obviously. And you know, most people do not have like First Amendment rights like in their jobs and in things to just say things and no, they can't be fired or something. But colleges, public universities in particular, some private universities, depending on the protections they tell their students they're going to have, do have this special obligation, unique almost in all of society, to allow uncomfortable, crazy discussions to take place in the public space on campus. I agree. If you're Hillel, if you're a group, you should be able to you can organize your group how it wants. You don't have to admit everyone. The professor gets to be in charge of the classroom and so on. But I mean, you can if you write in chalk on the public square at the University of Michigan, you know, elect Trump 2016. There were students who called the police on you for doing that.
Well, that's ridiculous.
Right, and I'm glad that you agree it's ridiculous, but it's a problem.
Samantha.
I agree with what you said, and I agree with what Robbie said, and I think that right now, you know, there's another issue, and I touched on the issue of social media, but I think, you know, a lot of what's happening with free speech, both on campus and off, has to do with the fact that, you know, technologically we haven't caught up in our views of speech with what's happening technologically. I mean, I cannot tell you now the number of case submissions to fire that involve faculty or administrators who are fired for something they tweeted. I mean, a dean at the University of Alabama just resigned. I'm putting it in quotes. I don't know what happened, but, you know,
We know what happened.
we know. You know, after tweets that he wrote critical of, I guess, racism at the university or something years ago came to light. You know, you had Steven Saleta at the University of Illinois. This is an issue across the political spectrum, you know, for faculty on the right and the left, and it really highlights the fact that part of what's happening is we're sort of grappling with things that we haven't had to grapple before and don't know how to handle. And I think, you know, a college campus being a place where, you know, always at the forefront of technology. My dad's a college professor, and he had email and, you know, a web browser way before anyone else did. That's another part of the reason that a lot of these things are being played out so heavily on college campuses.
Samantha, I'm glad you say it's across the political spectrum, though. That is a very important point. I'm sorry.
So I do think it's worth noting that the kinds of conversations, as challenging and sometimes fraught as they are on college campuses, are happening on college campuses in ways that probably are very different from what happens in a neighborhood, in a bar, or even at a think tank, where like-minded people come together. Social classes are segregated, races are segregated. Inequality in this country has made it very easy for people after they leave college to not interact very much with people who don't share their social class, their race, or their ideas. In a college campus like Wesleyan, you have a student who grew up in foster care living in the same suite as someone whose family's name is on the building. They have different experiences, they'll have different ideas, and sometimes they have a difficult time having a good conversation. Our job as teachers and administrators is to help them have more difficult conversations, not to back down from controversy when feelings get bruised or people get intimidated, but try to find a way to keep the conversation going, because people can learn from each other on a college campus in ways that get very hard to do as you get older and live in a silo beyond the university.
Sandy, quickly.
Yes, Kurt, in answer to your question, I think we have a free speech problem in this country that is reflected at colleges and universities, and that's not surprising. Often, larger social, cultural trends get reflected in the educational community. And I think some of it has been exacerbated, quite honestly, by a calculated strategy of trying to reduce confidence from the top political leadership of the country in the media, and to say that the media are the enemies of the people, to say that, well, yesterday I think he said that the New York Times should be shut down because he doesn't agree with a story that the New York Times published. And, you know, there was a time when we all laughed at this, but then when some people at a newspaper in Annapolis that had been published since the mid-1800s, when 6 people were shot and killed by somebody who, from one of these right-wing nationalist movements who was listening to the president, we have to worry about that language. So I think this is coming from the larger society and being reflected on college campuses.
So I have a thought on that, which I'll come back to, but I want to turn to our audience member now, please, and please introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Tom Davey, and I'm an alum here. The first good thing is not acrimonious, and a lot of agreement across the board. I hear a lot of descriptive versus normative. Every time the folks who are arguing that there are problems, your response is, well, that was an absurd thing to happen. And you're correct. But I think we need to acknowledge that they are actually happening. And it's not just crazy students like Milo in California. When Condoleezza Rice cannot speak at Brandeis because she's a conservative, you got a problem.
Well, that's ridiculous. That's horrible.
But that point is, it's
don't think it's
happening.
horrible.
But however, it is happening. And I thought that the point of the debate was, is there a problem?
Right.
I think clearly there is.
And I think you raised an important question here, and I want to put a sharp point on it as well, because Michael and I talked about this about 3 months ago. Condoleezza Rice is one of the most accomplished black women in America. She was Secretary of State. She was National Security Advisor. And twice she has been invited and then disinvited from giving commencement speeches at college campuses. Michael, what do you say about that?
Well, you know, I think that the invitation to speak at commencement is like hiring a band for a wedding. You can make a big mistake, and has very little to do with the intellectual content of the commencement speaker. I've been to more commencements than almost anyone here.
Wow.
Yeah, maybe even when you, and there are some that are memorable, but they're few and far between, and the students never remember them. That said, I do think that when you're honoring someone that a good percentage of your students think is responsible for a horrific war that was based on lies, whether they're right or not, that's their strong feeling, it was a mistake to invite that person as accomplished as you think she is. At the time when we had this conversation, I didn't realize how your relation to her work. But I don't think that students exercising their right to protest a commencement speaker is a problem. The administration makes a decision whether you want to make commencement into an occasion for protest. I think if you invited Condoleezza Rice to talk about the Iraq War at a university, they might be protesters, but she should be able to speak. That's, I think, quite different from a commencement celebration where disinvitations will be preferable to some administrators than having big demonstrations at the commencement.
Robbie, Samantha?
I mean, I hear you a little bit about commencement, but President Obama was my commencement speaker at the University of Michigan. There's probably some far-right reactionary student who thinks Obama's a socialist and shouldn't have been able to speak, and I would have hated for that person to get his way. Even if the speaker, maybe not for commencement, but in other cases is someone I find loathsome, I might be interested in learning more about why and how they're loathsome. One of my formative experiences as a student reporter at the University of Michigan was I got to interview the Weather Underground guy, Bill Ayers. He came to campus. And this is a person that half the country thinks is a literal terrorist and was engaged in bombings throughout the 60s. Certainly there would be tons of people who would have wanted to stop on safety grounds me from being able to interview this very interesting historical figure that was a great educational experience for me. So I'm inclined to always say, well, you might not like the person, you might not want them to be here, but maybe someone has something to benefit from or something to gain from having had this conversation.
I agree. I think commencement's a little different because of the occasion, but I introduced Justice Scalia at Wesleyan when he came to visit, despite my strong feelings that of the disastrous impact of his interpretation of the Constitution, but that my feelings really didn't matter. I mean, it's just, we invited him, he gave a talk, there were protests. I would have been in the protests had I not been introducing him, but we did not allow the protest to keep the event from happening. And he spent a day with students in vigorous debate, and I think that is much preferable to closing things down.
I can understand why an administration would make a decision to choose a commencement speaker in the first place who's wholly apolitical. I mean, I went to Princeton, and pretty much every year the commencement speaker, at least at the time I went, was the university president. But I think that once the administration chooses someone, if they choose a public figure, then when you allow student protests and objections to drive a decision to disinvite that person, then it goes back to what I said in my opening remarks about allowing student demands for censorship to drive decisions about who can and can't speak at a university. And I think that is deeply problematic.
Very interesting. Do we have another question in the audience? I see in the front row here.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for.
Please
Closer
introduce
to
yourself.
Oh, hello. Hi. My name is Nika. I graduated in 2018 from the University of Virginia. While I was there, I was an RA, and I had to go through mandatory training of, racial bias mandatory training, and also an addition was for me to deal with gender fluid people. And in my emails, when I addressed my students, I had to, put he, him, his in my email signed out, so I did not offend anybody. So this gets into a different debate, which is universities telling their employees how they can and cannot talk, of being prescribed certain language that you have to use, which I think is problematic. Also, with regards to filters, we acknowledge that high schools imposing filters on their students is problematic, but then we kind of brushed over how universities, which tend to be liberal places, put in these filters that are desired by a largely liberal group, which is university students. So is that not an issue, that a university is placing filters on its faculty, its students, in order to appeal to the students and nobody else?
I'm sorry,
What kind of filters
what are you referring to as the filters? I don't quite...
Mr. Michael said that there are some filters that the university must in place to keep, creationists from speaking or...
I think there's standard academic...
get that.
Academic journals don't publish everything. They don't bring people willy-nilly to the university to speak about things that they don't know about. I mean, even if you had a group that sponsored, I don't know, it's not unthinkable. Vaping is good for you, and they're going to give out free pens at a university. Just because a student group, let's say, invited such a group doesn't mean the university has to provide a platform for that speaker. And we always are making judgments about what kinds of things belong at a university and what kinds of things don't. And it's messy. I don't think there's a litmus test. I think when most of the time one errs on the side of more discussion is good, but sometimes the people who want to engage in the discussion are going to pollute the campus rather than enlighten the campus.
So I think this raises an interesting question too. Just how do we think about colleges? Are these public spaces, or are these private entities that can control what their employees do, what they can say, what they wear? Which is it?
It depends a lot on whether they're public or private universities, for one thing.
But on some of the subject that you mentioned, I mean, on gender and sex, there has been a tremendous censorship effort, almost in some sense forced on colleges and universities by the odd interpretation of Title IX under the Obama administration that came out of in 2011. This was guidance to colleges, encouraging them much more broadly to see a broader spectrum of conduct as violating the federal statute that prohibits sexual discrimination or gender-based discrimination in colleges and universities. Again, this was explicit federal guidance that, while well-intentioned, caused lots of administrators at lots of different schools to overinterpret it. I remember reading about at City University of New York, the administrators sending messages to professors telling them, stop using gendered salutations in your emails to each other because this could run afoul of Title IX. Our federal funding would be at risk, or our students' tuition assistance would be at risk if you referred to each other with Mr. and Ms. in emails, which obviously Title IX has nothing to do with that, and that would not, it was never intended, and no court would agree that it was intended to prohibit that kind of speech. But this is a compliance culture thing. This is being too fearful and too afraid. And some of that was guidance from on high that had a terribly pernicious effect.
Right. I mean, there was a researcher at Brown University who published a study that she had done involving parents in online forums who were discussing what she thought might be a new form of gender dysphoria called she called it rapid onset gender dysphoria. It was something that she said was distinct from the kind of gender dysphoria that begins in early childhood, and this was among groups of teenagers who were connected in school and on social media. And initially, when she published this research, Brown issued a press release about it and made the research available on its website. But then when there was a backlash from the transgender community, they pulled it down. And so, that's an example of, I think what you were saying is both right that, I think we've moved to some degree the Overton window on what is considered an acceptable or unacceptable discussion on campus, in the sense that, things like Holocaust denial, it may be reasonable to say, okay, well, we're not going to have a creationist speak in a biology class or a Holocaust denier, but, on topics where our understanding of things and even the science is still changing, to suddenly say that for political reasons, certain things are beyond the bounds of discussion, I think at a university poses a lot of problems.
Well, I think first of all it has to be said that many college administrators make hasty, not always very wise decisions. And there are tremendous pressures. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm not doing the job anymore, but I did it for 13 years. And for one thing, inviting commencement speakers was a total no-win proposition. Whatever you did, you would make somebody angry, and there would be a problem. And I remember when I first became a college president, talking to someone a woman, a well-known person, college president, and I said, well, she was about to retire. And I said, what will you miss the most? And she said, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what I'll miss the least is selecting commencement speakers. It was that much pressure. So yes, there are some silly decisions that are made about taking down a research study. I don't know anything about the reasons they may have taken it down, but it doesn't make it go away. You can still access it, I can still access it, and we can have a dim opinion of the people who wouldn't leave it out there. But I have to agree with Michael that there are certain things, I made a particular effort to have a great ideological range of speakers on my campus at Goucher College, but I did not feel obligated to invite someone to expound white supremacy. We fought a war over that. We've decided about white supremacy. It's not going to be character building for minority students to hear totally discredited theories of white supremacy.
Okay, let's
And especially in a private
Just
institution.
very quickly, I do think, and this is kind of I guess the theme of our discussion is these are bad cases, and they are troubling. I think that's the word. But women students still have a very different experience of a college campus than men do. My daughter had to learn how to not to drink from the punch bowl at certain places because they would be. Everybody knew that there would be drugs in there, and that sexual assault on college campus was a tremendous and remains a tremendous problem. And we're talking about whether a professor at Brown is featured on the website. I sit there with rape victims and their fathers and mothers who wonder, how does it happen that you have a culture on the campus where there are certain spaces that all the women on campus know? You shouldn't go into that house. How come that house is still there? How come you haven't closed that house? And so these are bad things, but compared to transgender kids getting beat up on colleges all over the country, the fact that you have to put that you prefer male pronouns, I'm sorry. That's a high-class problem.
Very good. We have a question here in the audience as well. Do we have a microphone? And please introduce yourself again.
Yeah, my name is Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill. I'm the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center Campus Free Expression Project. We may end up agreeing more, but I have a question for Dr. Roth and Mr. Unger. Both of you talked about the broader context of our political society and Citizens United, and Dr. Roth, I think you said buck up, and Mr. Unger to be more courageous. It seems to me, in some sense, to say we're in a very difficult time, as we obviously are in our entire political society, in terms of freedom of expression and Citizens United case.
Jackie, can you bring the microphone?
Oh, okay, thank you. The Citizens United case has made it more difficult in many ways in the political arena. It seems to me that colleges and universities are very special spaces where we have a higher standard for discourse. And in a way, the question shouldn't be, are college campuses eroding free speech, but are college campuses and college leadership doing enough to really bolster free speech, to say, in this very complicated political society and fraught political society, when you come onto our campuses today, there's a standard of discourse and obligation to, that there isn't in the public square to respond to a question or a challenge that comes to you in a campus. And so the ones, even though whatever the number it is, I think there are students who really do feel they have to self-censor. And what should college leaders be doing to make sure that students understand there is a higher standard, and we're really making sure it is safe for them to have those kind of rich, difficult conversations that are not about creationists or, the flat earth people or the Holocaust deniers who are very, very few. I mean, it's the ones who do want to defend, say, the Gulf War and or the Iraq War, in spite of its terrible cost, was worth it, or that gay marriage shouldn't be legal. Those are the people who do really have a hard time.
So I think your question, if I got it, is shouldn't colleges be doing more to protect and encourage a climate of free speech rather than playing defense?
I agree. I mean, I called a few years ago for a affirmative action program for conservative ideas broadly conceived, so that we wouldn't just have provocateurs and entertainers coming to campus to test our free speech credentials. Because I don't think you can just depend on the marketplace of ideas. I do think there's a lot of implicit bias on college campuses. The ones I know, that bias tends to be to the left. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of religious schools in the country that have different kinds of biases. But I do think we have to be proactive in creating a better conversation among interesting points of view that might be disturbing. And we, as deans and presidents and provosts, but mostly as teachers, have to create that space in the classroom where people are not actually engaging the conversation out of devotion to content neutral ways of thinking about free speech. They're devoted to, they're exercising their conversational abilities because they want to learn, and in an environment where they may feel themselves unmoored, they will feel themselves challenged, and that's a task of teachers. And I think insofar as universities and colleges have gotten more consumerist, where they just want to please students because the students are paying and the students have a transactional mentality, which happens, of course, in many schools, public and private, teachers may give up on creating this space for a rich conversation among ideas that matter.
Well, my partner and I don't agree on everything we've said tonight, but I totally endorse what he just said. I think that it is the role of colleges and universities to promote a broader definition of free speech. And I do think one needs to take, I don't know if affirmative action is the right word, but needs to take steps to make sure that everyone can express him or herself as a student, as a faculty member, as a staff member, and not feel that there's a general party line that has to be followed. I think in most great universities and well-run colleges and universities, that is possible. It may not be represented as well as it needs to be, but I think it is possible in most places. But I agree with you, Jackie, that more needs to be done to distinguish the higher education sector as a sanctuary for free thought.
Mm-hmm. So one thing, Michael, that's interesting in what you said is that if you need an affirmative action plan for conservative ideas, the assumption is that universities are a bastion of liberal ideas to begin with.
Well, that there is an ideological bias to the left in the humanities and interpretive social sciences.
And does everyone agree with that, or would you dispute that?
In many schools. I mean,
in many schools.
Yeah.
I agree with it. Perhaps my experience is somewhat different from Michael's, but yes, I'm a little more, I think my view would be slightly more nuanced, but.
Okay. And then the issue that I wanted to throw out earlier, and I'll come back to it now, is in some ways I'm wondering if the issue isn't one of civility. It's not so much that you can't say things. It's that the climate in which you are living is deterring the expression of free ideas, that people feel constrained because of the social pressure, the Twitter feeds that you mentioned, the abuse, shouting, protest. It has created a climate of lack of civil discourse, which I think throws a wet blanket over expression of ideas.
Well, if you feel that way and you're wrong, then you're just wrong. I mean, like I think many right of center students are afraid to express their views because they think their professors are going to retaliate against them. And I think that view is wrong. I think their professors by and large, the vast majority are interested in hearing from them anyway. They probably like the break from the monotony of all their far left students. And I don't think this idea that the professors are so, I mean, I'm on the side of the professors. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think the professors are afraid if they do something wrong or they say something wrong, they're going to be investigated, and their administrators are not going to, are going to actually go through with these investigations, or are not going to as fully and robustly defend their rights as they would like them to be. So the students might have a wrongful impression of that they can't speak out or something in that case. I think happens. I think that's probably true. But then there's also the related problem of other students might very well object and might actually do some really nasty things to them. They would be correct to fear reprisals from other students, and reprisals that might elevate all the way to sort of administrative sanction, as we've seen happen on numerous occasions.
Okay. Michael, did you want to comment or no?
Well, I think the effort to raise the bar for higher education should include an active effort by schools that do feel they have this bias on the faculty, and sometimes in the curriculum. That doesn't mean that you can't teach something that is not out of your own ideological preference, but to make sure we're bringing very thoughtful voices from conservative, religious, and libertarian traditions to campus, not to provoke the students or the faculty, but for the serious study of those ideas. And at some schools, I think that doesn't happen enough. And when it doesn't, I think we just have to be proactive in bringing interesting ideas into the mix that some of our colleagues wouldn't do on their own.
Can I just raise one? Is there not certainly a problem if Berkeley needs to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in security fees to allow either Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro to speak there? Hundreds of thousands of dollars to guarantee those two individuals, or I'm sure Charles Murray or Heather McDonald, someone like that, to guarantee their safety from the people in that community who would physically attack them if there was not a wall of police officers at the campus where the free speech movement was born in the 1960s. There is a problem, right? If that's the reality, there not?
Yes, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem, but in the 60s, it wasn't like they were going to just champion content-neutral free speech. You know, Mario Savio said, throw yourselves on the gears of the machine. He would have been at the front line of fighting against using the university as a platform in that way. I'm not defending that. I mean, it is a problem that the University of California has to sponsor someone who has no relationship to the university or its educational mission, and then spend all this money providing security. But that's a problem of a university that's very different from mine, because that's a university in a city where many of the protesters are not related to the university. I think it's a real problem, but I think it's symptomatic of using the university as a stage. And using the university as a stage either to make political points about free speech, or in his case, just for self-aggrandizement and attacking minorities. That's too bad to use the university as a stage. The university should be a place of learning and not a stage for buffoons.
Well, Robbie, the thing I have a problem with, and I respect this concern about Berkeley and a few other places having to spend a ridiculous amount of money, but these are not the representatives who are going to, it's not going to be these circus performers who are going to advance the cause of serious dialogue across the political spectrum. This is a show, it's an entertainment, and it's not so entertaining anymore, and so it's time to move on from those same talks, those same events coming.
Well, certainly, I totally agree. But just if everyone had the opinion that, oh yeah, that person is terrible, I hate them, but whatever, do their thing, and if that was everyone's opinion, there would be no need for security fees. There'd be no spectacle. Obviously, someone is seriously enough against this that there's a problem.
They were baited, and then they took the bait.
Yeah, and the repeated invitations are a provocation. I mean, what is there left that people at Berkeley haven't heard from Milo Yiannopoulos?
No, I mean, no disagreement on the content of these people.
I'd rather have
it's
you
an easy test
invited
of free
to
speech
talk.
that everyone is failing. I get not everyone.
So
Enough people are failing.
We're going to give
Cause a
one
problem.
final audience question. I see a new face here. So, and then we're going to come to wrap up with 1 minute each. But first, the question.
Casey Maddox, I'm with the Charles Koch Institute. Most of this conversation has basically been focused on culture on campus. And I think maybe one way we could, and it's a little challenging because it's, you can cite examples and then you're left with, well, here's an example of bad culture. Well, yeah, I agree that that's a bad example. I think FIRE's data shows that about 90% of colleges still have actual written policies that are either red or yellow light, meaning they infringe on First Amendment rights. And those are the policies that have been written down by adults. University General Counsel or someone in that office has presumably looked at that policy and said, this is good to go. And they've sent it to the printer, made it public, and said, this is what we intend to do, and they're unconstitutional. So this whole conversation around culture, but shouldn't universities at least be expected to take the step of looking at their own written policies and making sure that what they're telling students is actually in compliance with the First Amendment?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to their credit, an increasing number of them are. I mean, when I started at FIRE, I think we had about 8 green light institutions, and now green light meaning they don't have speech codes that, either public university are unconstitutional or private university would be unconstitutional off campus. I think schools deserve credit for the extent to which they have begun to rethink some of these speech codes, but as you say, they still persist at a lot of universities, and they can be, even if a university doesn't deploy them in every instance, they can deploy them sort of as needed to suppress protected speech. So yes, speech codes on campus definitely continue to be a problem and continue to be used across the spectrum to suppress student protest and dialogue around a variety of issues.
So we found that the FIRE ranking was a problem because one of our students who was interning at FIRE wrote a piece about it on the FIRE blog and sent it to me. I had him as a student and myself, and so these are codes that had never been used, like the death penalty for disobeying your parents, which was a part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They hadn't been used, but they do send a signal. So I talked to the people at FIRE and said this actually. I think what the speech code when they were written before my time, they aimed at this, and they said, well, you could be much more precise, and it wasn't so much about running afoul of the legalistic definition, although I prefer not to run afoul, but to actually articulate more clearly a message that wouldn't chill speech. And so we were able to change our codes, and then the people at FIRE said, there are still other ones that are problematic, and I think we should actually make them clearer, because even if we don't employ them, they can send the wrong signal.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. We're going to wrap up, and I'd like to go down the line just one by one, 1 minute or less. Just give me one recommendation, something you would like to recommend that colleges or universities or society would do. And Sandy, we'll start with you, and Samantha, you get the last word.
Well, I would say, and this is based on the real effort we've made in the Free Speech Project to examine the motives for suppressing speech around the country. I think that a lot of people have to just relax and let controversy occur, because controversy is in our blood, controversy is in our daily life, and you cannot hope any more in a college than you can in a high school that everybody's going to come into agreement that with one point of view or another. But it does have to be done in a civil manner, and I think people need to be taught how to listen to each other. So I would think that would be my top priority for reform if I were in a position to make it.
Thank you. Michael?
My top priority would be to have a university leadership and then faculty and students cultivate intellectual diversity on campus of the sort that is going to be powerfully educative. I think that colleges and universities can be demonized and often are demonized by forces that have an agenda that is really scary, actually, and not about the colleges, but about the rest of the country. But on college campuses, what we can do is to remind our students that intellectual diversity gives them an opportunity to expand their horizons, to become empowered to work in the world, to be more alive, and to discover things that are more true than what they previously believed.
Robbie?
Well, I've done a lot of criticizing the left, so I guess in my concluding thought, I'll say that it is incumbent on conservative students, right-leaning students, to stop inviting the same three people, only to get them shut down, only to be able to turn around and then play the victim on cable news or on the right-wing sites that cover these kinds of things. They are doing it often intentionally to play the victim. It's poisonous and bad and wrong, and they should stop.
Very good. Thanks. Samantha.
In addition to a return, increased intellectual diversity, I think we need a return to intellectual humility. There's a saying I love by the Jewish sage Ben Zoma that says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from every man." And I love that saying because I think it reflects that, no matter who's speaking, whether it's someone you agree or disagree with, we all have something to learn. And I think, among students in particular, but among a lot of people in society at large, going to some of what we were talking about, there's just a lack of intellectual humility that prevents a lot of discourse. I also think courage to stand up to would-be censors needs to start from the top down. I talked about Yale's silence in the Christakis controversy. I want to just end with a positive example. The University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Students were demanding that Camille Paglia, who's a very prominent, outspoken feminist, but she said some things about the Me Too movement that offended people. When students started petitioning and demanding that she be fired, the president of UArts, David Yeager, gave a very eloquent statement in which he said, artists have been censored throughout history for their expression. Not now, not at UArts. That was a model of courage, and far from amplifying the controversy, it shut down that show of strength shut down the controversy, and I think that leadership needs to follow that model.
Very good. Very good. Thank you all very much. Please give a round of applause for our debaters here. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you for coming. That wraps it up. We will be launching our next debate on foreign policy topics about U.S. policy in Afghanistan sometime in late October, November. We'll be back to you about that. Thank you all very, very much.